Hi, my name is Benedict. This video is going to be about programming drums. I'm not going to go too deep, but the question to me was, gee, how do you get into programming drums that aren't just four on the floor? The fellow who asked this question has spent a lot of time in the EDM space and listening to all the rules and what have you, and that creates this kind of narrowing down fear where you feel like you can only put the kick on the four. And it's a shame because even without getting into really cool, complex polyrhythmic stuff or anything like that, there's so much that you can do even within the rigid drum machine space. So I'm just going to show, and this is all going to be done in real time as is normal with me. So if I seem a little unfocused, that's because this is happening in real time. But I'm going to show a few different ways to think about saying, hey, this is the way I could approach drum rhythms a little differently. Just so you can see, the drum machine in use will be my own ADS-8. So there's nothing about, we're not talking about drum sounds and what's cool and what's not. We're merely talking about how we might use simple rhythms. So, as I said, we tend to start out and find ourselves kind of trapped in this space where we can only do this. And while it's an incredibly effective form, that four on the floor, the problem is that it's awfully rigid and it has no roll or flow or groove to it. I've made another video about groove, about using swing and what have you. That's not what this one's going to be about. This is just about note or hit placement to give us some very simple ways of doing something different, and from there to be able to start to experiment with our own ideas to come up with our own things. So the first and obvious one, which has been largely forgotten, is this. The essentials of a military or a rock bass. Boom cha, boom cha, boom cha. That's actually really powerful. Very powerful. You can double that with four on the floor. One of the problems with doing that is that you are now lacking the variety of there's this sound and then there's that sound. One of the great things about drums, percussion, the whole gamut of things that aren't pianos, is that we can create rhythmic variety. And if every sound is the same as every other sound, we lack that variety of going, ooh, that sounded like that there, but now it sounds like this here. It's variety. So straight away, that allows us to move ourselves. It may not seem as directly powerful as a four on the floor, but it actually gives us a lot of freedom. The next thing that we might look at doing there is the obvious of going, okay, let's put some hi-hats in. Let's just do that. Let's do the very obvious. Again, really basic rock. If you went to an old drum machine, like an early 80s drum machine, that's probably what the rock pattern did. At least rock 1 would have done that. The disco pattern probably would have done this. Get rid of those, move that to there. Even though it's twee and mechanical, see how those three sounds, we're calling the hi-hat one sound, see how those three sounds, really it's kind of four because the hi-hat does something different, but see how those sounds interact by having them in different places. So if we were to put them all on the same place, that's actually our rhythm. Not very interesting. But as soon as we spread that out, we've got a lot of variety. Obviously, what you do depends on what the rest of your piece is doing. Please don't be one of those people who programs a drum pattern and then tries to work out what they can put into it. You're going to limit your music tremendously. The idea is that, yes, music can be built up around drums, but as long as you're doing that, if you're not an accomplished musician, you probably won't do anything but play on the beats, which is limiting. It's better to do it the other way round. So if you're at all unsure, if you find that you get limited in your music making, turn off the drums, or at least put them down to a basic 4 on the floor and ignore them, so that you can develop the rhythmical variety that you want out of your instruments, what your bass is doing. Now, that's a possibility for what we could do here. We could make this go a little bit more rigid again. See, little change. It's rigid, but it works nicely. The open hat on the end gives us some release. Now, this is a 2-bar pattern. A lot of drum machines work on a 1-bar pattern. I tend to build on a 2-bar pattern. As soon as I've got my basic, okay, that's my 2-bar pattern, I'll copy it out to 4 bars and create some variation. Won't go too far into that, at least not to start with. So again, we've got a different rhythm. We might call that rock 2. But now we can start to say, well, what if we add some extra little bits and pieces? Ooh. You probably don't want that every 2 bars. But if I copied this out to 4 bars, then at bar 4, that's probably what I'd be doing. It's like, ooh, there's an extra little hitch there that wasn't there before. So it creates some excitement and throws us into the coming bar 1, at which we might do something different. Let's see what I've got here. Okay. Very subtle. It's a small sound. Now, if I'd taken this out to 16 bars, on bar 1, I might well have used a cymbal, which I don't have here. And then on bar 5, probably would have put this little wood block or whatever it is. That gives us a lot of variety. We've got 8 bars, which are essentially the same, but those little variations are going to give us a feel of movement over time. They're like, oh, it does this here, and it does that there. That's interesting. That's basically how these things work. Now, that's just using basically our main beats of the bar. Let's actually trash this all together. Start with another 4 on the floor. Oh, not very exciting, is it? So let's look at doing something different with it. Let's look at doing the opposite of what we think we want to do. Let's see what we got. That's a really nice military sort of move. Now, you might be thinking, oh, but that's not EDM, Benedict, so it's not relevant. Well, firstly, please, if you can only see one thing, this is probably not for you. But otherwise, if you can see it in yourself, open your mind, because you can do anything that you actually want to do in EDM. People have used the techno form to do all kinds of interesting things, from Enigma through to full-on stuff that's kind of like metal without being. So there's a massive amount of space there. So just by doing something a little bit different here. Now, what if we start adding in secondary notes, grace or ghost notes? I'm going to put them in fairly randomly here. There. Let's see what happens. That's interesting. Obviously, we need to match it to a piece, but for the right piece with the right things going on, that's actually a surprisingly cool rhythm, even though there's very little to it. So we don't need to get crazy complex before we actually start to get interesting things going on. Let's just look at putting some unexpected beats in here. Need another one there. You want symmetry so that things feel like they flow. That flows. Let's swap it to this sound. Now this bit on the back end is actually starting to imitate some of the feel of the Latin bell patterns that you hear with their wood blocks or any kind of chime struck bell type thing. So any of those Latin dance styles, a lot of them basically formed around this bell pattern, which rolls along and helps the dancers. Now we wouldn't want that every single cycle, but nonetheless, you see how by putting things in between, we're now breaking up the rigidity of our main pattern. So if I were to double this out, which I would do now, I'd go, yep, I've got a really nice workable pattern. In the first pair of bars, I'd just have that. And in the second, I'd have the whole pattern. So we end up with something like that. So you see the variety in there makes it come alive without having to do anything particularly complex. You know, we're not hiring smelly people who can play polyrhythmically with their two hands or using drum loops or anything like that. It's really, really simple. So that's kind of a backwards pattern because we've got our snare on the front end. Let's go back to a 4 on the floor. Looks like I lost my 4. Not holding down the control button, obviously. We'll kill that one there because we do not want it. 2 bars. Back to boring land. But there's another thing which is very common in rock or particularly ballads. That's too fast. So we will take those, put them there. It's still too fast for what I was going for, but we've now got something interesting. Then that there is movement. We've got 3 different sounds, not remotely interesting pattern, but because the sounds are different, it feels interesting. Now that's what's called syncopation, where you expect the beat here, this is the dominant beat, but we've used a weak beat, an off beat instead. That makes a very cool drum machine pattern. you probably wouldn't have a human player play that, at least not over and over like that. It's a kind of pattern that they might use in between. So they have their dominant patterns that are running through the song, and it's a break of some kind. They might put that in. Quite similar to in Guns N' Roses' Sweet Child of Mine, in the middle eight or whatever, Duff or whoever kind of plays his bass line backwards. Boom, 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 boom. It's a really cool moment. This is like that. So you might set that up as your main rhythm, but you might use that as you're joining two other things together. Or you might just say, hey, I'm going to use that as my main rhythm because it's very cool. It's the kind of thing that was done with early drum machines a lot. But let's, for the moment, delete those. We want a much simpler pattern. So one, you might want to put that back there. You might think there's nothing there, Benedict, but you're right, there is nothing there, and that's the whole idea. We're merely very loosely marking time, and this is a commonly used pattern early in ballads. So Elton John or something like that, his drummer might be doing that. We'll be doing maybe a kick, maybe even no kick. So we might have something more like run for quite some time through the song until we're going to get to at least the first chorus, and then he might roll some toms, or he might not, or he might just put some kicks in. You can't see my foot going, and possibly drop back to this, or drop back to putting that in. Or if we're picking up a little, now, there's a lot of space in there, but the music itself should be doing something interesting. If it's just holding, yeah, it's boring, isn't it? But if you wanted to go minimal, it's still surprisingly effective little pattern that you can use, often by not using the snare, but by using another sound. That's the same thing, but by going into a tom, we've now got quite a different sort of feel. Let's go with copying this again. And let's see what we get. Unusual pattern, really unusual, but to throw it away out of hand because it's different would be a big mistake, because again, as a pattern where we're changing between two main parts, that's going to be really quite arresting. It's a way of keeping time but allowing the rhythmic part, the drummer part, to back off. A big problem with a lot of real drummers, and I question how real they are, but they're there sitting with a kit, is that they think they have to go full on all the time. And that's a real massive problem when you come to mix. If they're playing at 99.999% of their ability, their hardness, their thwackiness through the first verse, when we come to the chorus, they've got at best 0.1% of somewhere to go. But they've probably tired themselves out. So by the time they get to the end of the first chorus, as we get into the second verse, they've either become like a machine just going at it before they pass out, or they've actually started to fall back to maybe 80%, which is a real problem. So don't feel like your drums need to be 110% all the time. That's a big mistake. You've got to ebb and flow. So between this kooky pattern, which is almost like an industrial ballad, assuming such a thing is doable, but anything is doable, we have got something interesting. Now see, with the addition just of that snare, it's put onto a strong beat. This is leading on an off beat, as is this. Suddenly we've changed the feel of our thing. We don't need a lot. And we've got something completely different again. I think this is it. Yeah, that's, sorry, I forgot where that went. That was here. This is, from memory, the house pattern. The very basic house music pattern. Not house music as people know it now, so please don't feel the need to write in and tell me I don't know what I'm doing. This is house music from the early days, really early acid house. It's a syncopated beat, so you see the kick gets moved off. I showed you syncopated before. And there it is again. Let's get rid of them there. Move them. So we've got a lot of stuff that's off. And that's cool. And sort of a variation of that. I wouldn't use that as my first main riff, drum riff, although I might. But again, as a secondary riff that comes in, really nice and useful. Let's reset ourselves to where we need to be. It'll do 4. The fact that we're using a 4/4 is probably a little bit of a problem, so let's do something different. Let's go all. I got nothing. So let's program something that's kind of going to seem a little random. That there. Let's see what we've got. This is random. So I doubt we're going to end up with something that's stunning, but then let's see if we can make something that works from it. Now there's a lot in here that's actually really quite useful. See if you can pick out what it is and come up with the same conclusion I do. Let's take this guy and move him. Take all these and pull them back. Now let's see what we've got. We need something in here. Now we do have a rhythmic issue here. Now we're right. Now sometimes it's very cool to have something outside of the rhythm, but it all depends on what else is happening. If your bass line is going to be playing a dominant note here, but you've got your dominant drums here, you can have just a jumble, a mess. Fine to have an incidental note there, but we generally want to keep rhythmic strength together. But it's these extra little bits and pieces, and notice how few kicks we've got. Rather than saying we have to have kicks, we could, I don't think I've got the right sounds for it, but we could get rid of the kicks altogether. Now, I would use that all day. If I've got something that matches that, it's a really cool rolling drum machine pattern with a lot of character. Yes, it doesn't sound like EDM, but it's not supposed to. If we had an EDM form outside of it, if I were running 2 drum kits, which occasionally I do, if I were running 2 drum kits, and that used to be very, very standard in techno. Techno always used to run 2 drum kits. There was your main kit, which was your big, and then you would have your secondary kit. And that's something that was definitely started in it's probably always been there in at least Latin music, because they have their main drummer, and then they have percussionists, or 300 percussionists if it's Santana. But there was that tendency towards having the drummer and a drum machine. And techno picked that up as well, because they realized, we can have so much more variety. So here, I might have that as a secondary thing. The way that I would set it up, compress and EQ and what have you, is to make these sounds fairly small, and then I would have my main boom, 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 and these happening inside it. And boy, would it, like this, which should be really cool. But if I'm making something that's not meant to be super powerful, but I want it to roll along and funk and groove a little bit, wonderfully Benedict mechanical sort of a way, that's going to do the job really well. Now remember, when I started making this little pattern, I basically threw stuff at the page. I listened to what I got and shaped it to say, okay, I like that bit, I want to make that bit go here or there, and made it fit. That's kind of like being random or listening to the song gods, because they said, hey, let's do that. And I've gotten a cool result out of that, even though it's nothing like, and this is a great thing, it's nothing like what we would have started out with if I'd still had those 4 on the floor. Hopefully that shows you enough to give you a sense of that rhythmic programming does not have to be tied to the kick or the 4, that it can be really anywhere at all. If you're too random, then you don't develop a rhythm. And initially we had some problems with this, but I put it into a form, so we've now got a rhythm. Through the repetition of that pattern, we start to find how that grooves along. So don't expect to necessarily hear it first time, but once it's gone around, and you should have a rhythmic form from your music already, then once that goes around, you'll go, that's how that comes together. It works with and off, as in bounces off, this hitch in the bass line. And you may well find yourself then, if you're making a bass line, going boom, 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 or dup, boom, dup, boom, dup, boom, over and over, which is not very interesting, to then putting in perhaps grace notes. So you might be boom, 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 and that little extra note here, and the boop, boom, as the boop here that leads to the boom here, suddenly you've got movement, and you've got a little rhythmic part here as well, so that you've got a more complex rhythm overall because you're using more of these spots, but you don't want to use all of these spots. If you put an instrument on every single one of these lanes, vertical lanes, you'll find suddenly you don't have much in the way of rhythm at all. It's a balance between having a sound of a certain type, with certain frequencies, bright, not bright, big, not big, loud, not loud, versus space. So it's how you balance all of those that you get your groove. Hope you've learned something from this. As always, happy to answer questions down below.